The autumn sun was setting behind the gleaming glass windows of Riverside Mall, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. A young black man in his mid-30s walked through the main entrance, his steps echoing in the bustling space. He wore a comfortable gray hoodie and well-fitted jeans, his favorite weekend outfit, a welcome break from the suits he wore all week at the office. At the security desk, Officer Richard Barnes straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man walk past the luxury section of the mall. Richard had worked security at Riverside for 15 years, and he prided himself on what he called his sixth sense about troublemakers. In reality, this sense was nothing more than deeply rooted prejudice that he'd never bothered to examine. The young man paused outside Designer's Haven, one of the mall's most exclusive boutiques. Through the window, he could see a sleek leather briefcase that caught his eye, exactly what he needed for his upcoming business presentations. As he reached for the door handle, he noticed a reflection in the glass. The security guard was following him, maintaining what he thought was a discreet distance. Inside the store, the young man browsed quietly, running his fingers over the smooth leather of the briefcase. The price tag read $1,200, steep but worth it for the quality. He'd been saving up for something like this, a small reward to himself for landing the biggest project of his career. The few other customers in the store kept throwing glances his way, some clutching their bags closer. He was used to this treatment, but it didn't make it any less exhausting. He'd learned to keep his movements slow and deliberate, his hands visible, his expression neutral, all the unwritten rules of shopping while black. Officer Barnes didn't wait long to make his move. He strutted into the store, hand resting on his radio, chest puffed out with unearned authority. "Sir," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet store, "I'm going to need you to step outside." The young man turned slowly, keeping his hands in view. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Yes, there is." Barnes moved closer, his stance aggressive. "We've had some issues with shoplifting lately. I'm going to need to see some proof that you can actually afford to shop here." The store had gone silent. A mother hurried her children toward the exit. Someone had pulled out their phone and started recording. The young man felt his chest tighten, that familiar mix of anger, humiliation, and resignation washing over him. He'd been here before, too many times to count. "Officer," he said, keeping his voice steady, "I'm just looking at briefcases. I'm allowed to browse, aren't I?" Barnes stepped closer, his radio crackling. "Listen, buddy, I know your type. You're not here to buy anything. You're casing the joint, and I'm not going to let that happen on my watch." "My type?" The young man raised an eyebrow, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. "And what type would that be, exactly?" Barnes faltered for a moment, knowing he'd said too much, but doubled down anyway. "You know exactly what I mean. Now, either show me proof you can afford these items or leave. Otherwise, I'm calling the police." More phones were out now. The store manager hovered nervously in the background, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The young man looked around at the faces watching him, some sympathetic, others suspicious, most just uncomfortable and looking away. He could have pulled out his wallet right then, could have shown his platinum credit cards, his business cards, his ID that proved he lived in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. But why should he have to? Why should anyone have to prove their worth based on the color of their skin? "You know what?" he said quietly, setting the briefcase down with careful precision. "I don't need to prove anything to you, but I want you to remember this moment, Officer Barnes." He glanced at the name tag. "Remember it very clearly, because I have a feeling we'll be discussing it again soon." The security guard smirked, clearly satisfied with what he saw as a victory. "Let me escort you out," he said, reaching for his arm. "Don't touch me," the young man said firmly, walking toward the exit on his own. His steps were measured, his head held high. As he passed through the store's entrance, he could hear whispers behind him, the click of phone cameras, the rustle of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed what they had. Outside, the mall's regular bustle continued, oblivious to what had just happened. But something had shifted, like the calm before a storm. The young man walked to his car, not the beat-up vehicle Barnes had probably imagined, but a sleek new Tesla. As he sat in the driver's seat, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, it's me," he said quietly. "You know that mall renovation project I'm heading up?" "Yeah, Riverside. I think we need to move up tomorrow's meeting with management. We have some things to discuss. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Riverside Mall. Officer Richard Barnes arrived for his shift at 7 a.m. sharp, just like he had every day for the past 15 years. He straightened his uniform, polished his badge, and walked through the employee entrance with the same air of authority he always carried. Something felt different today, though. The usual morning cheerfulness of the cleaning staff was missing. Instead of their usual waves and greetings, they hurried past him with quick nods and averted eyes. Even Jenny at the coffee kiosk, who usually had his morning coffee ready with a smile, seemed unusually focused on wiping down her counter. "Morning, Jenny," he called out, trying to maintain his routine. "The usual." "Sorry, Officer Barnes," she replied without looking up. "Machine's broken today." He knew it wasn't. As he approached the security office, he noticed his supervisor's car in its reserved spot, unusual for this early hour. Through the glass walls, he could see Mrs. Thompson, the head of mall security, pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. Her face was pinched with worry, and she was still wearing yesterday's suit, had she been here all night. The moment he walked in, Mrs. Thompson ended her call. "Richard," she said, her voice tight. "Close the door and sit down." He did as he was told, his stomach starting to churn. On her desk, her computer screen showed a social media page. He caught a glimpse of a video thumbnail, the designer's Haven storefront. "Would you like to explain what happened yesterday?" Mrs. Thompson asked, turning her laptop around. The video was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Different angles, different phones, but all showing the same scene. Him confronting the young man in the hoodie. "I was just doing my job," he said defensively. "We've had problems with shoplifting," and he looked suspicious. Suspicious how, exactly? Mrs. Thompson cut him off. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. Because he was wearing casual clothes, because he was looking at expensive items, or because he was black. Barnes felt his face grow hot. "Now wait a minute, this isn't about." "Stop." Mrs. Thompson held up a hand. "Just stop. Do you have any idea what you've done? That man you harassed? He's the lead executive for Urban Development Partners, the same company that's about to start our $50 million renovation project." The blood drained from Barnes's face. He remembered the man's parting words. Remember this moment very clearly. "He's coming here this morning," Mrs. Thompson continued. "In fact, he should be here any minute. And do you know what he's bringing with him? Besides the contracts and blueprints for our entire renovation." She turned her screen again, showing an email. Footage from the past 3 months. Security camera footage that his team has already reviewed, showing a pattern of you following, harassing, and removing minority shoppers from the mall. Can to explain that? Barnes sat there, his mouth dry. The weight of his actions, not just yesterday but over years, began to settle on his shoulders. All those times he'd followed people around, all those random checks, all those shoppers he'd asked to leave. How many of them had been innocent? How many lives had he affected? The mall's early morning quiet was broken by the sound of expensive shoes on marble floors. Through the office windows, Barnes saw a small group of people walking toward them. Leading them was the man from yesterday, but not in a hoodie anymore. Today he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Barnes made in a month. His VIP access badge gleamed under the mall's lights. As they approached the security office, Barnes could see the mall manager walking beside him, nodding enthusiastically at whatever was being said. Behind them came 2 lawyers in dark suits, carrying tablets and folders. The young executive's eyes met Barnes's through the glass. There was no smugness there, no satisfaction at Barnes's obvious discomfort. Instead, there was something that made Barnes feel even worse: disappointment and what looked like determination. Mrs. Thompson stood up, straightening her jacket. "Richard, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Please hand over your badge and radio." As Barnes slowly unpinned his badge, the badge he'd worn with such pride for so many years, he realized that his whole world was about to change, and maybe, just maybe, it needed to. The conference room on the mall's top floor buzzed with nervous energy. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the tense faces gathered around the polished oak table. The mall manager kept adjusting his tie, while Mrs. Thompson reviewed her notes for the third time. The two lawyers sat silently, tablets ready. When the executive walked in, the atmosphere shifted. He carried himself with quiet confidence, setting his briefcase down before taking his seat at the head of the table. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, the mark of someone used to being in charge. "Thank you all for meeting on such short notice," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I think we all know why we're here." He pulled out a tablet and placed it on the table. "But before we discuss yesterday's incident, I'd like to share something with you." With a few taps, he started playing a series of video clips on the large screen at the end of the room. Security footage from the past 3 months began to play. A young mother with 2 children being followed through the toy store. An elderly man in traditional African clothing asked to leave the food court. A teenage girl in a hijab surrounded by security while trying to buy a birthday gift for her friend. And in every clip there was Officer Barnes. The mall manager's face grew paler with each video. Mrs. Thompson sat straight-backed, her expression professional, but her hands clenched tightly under the table. The lawyers exchanged glances and began taking notes. "In the past 3 months alone," the executive continued, "we've documented 47 incidents of discriminatory behavior. 47 times where shoppers were profiled, harassed, or removed from this mall for no reason other than their appearance." He paused, letting the weight of those numbers sink in. "As you know, my company is prepared to invest $50 million in renovating this mall. But a beautiful building means nothing if people don't feel safe and welcome inside it." The mall manager leaned forward, sweat visible on his forehead. "Sir, I want to assure you that Officer Barnes has been suspended, and we're prepared to terminate." The executive held up his hand. "Actually, that's not what I want." Everyone in the room stared at him in surprise. "Firing Officer Barnes might make you feel better. It might even make me feel better after what happened yesterday. But it won't solve the real problem." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot where early morning shoppers were starting to arrive. "You see those people down there? They're not just customers. They're families looking for a safe place to spend their weekends. They're teenagers getting their first jobs. They're elderly couples who've been coming here for morning walks for 20 years. They're new immigrants building their lives in this community. And they all deserve to feel welcome here." He turned back to the group. "So instead of firing Officer Barnes, I have a different proposal." Opening his briefcase, he pulled out a folder. "My company has partnerships with several organizations that specialize in diversity and inclusion training, not just surface-level seminars, but real, comprehensive programs that address the root causes of bias." The tension in the room began to shift into something else, possibility. "I want to implement a complete overhaul of your security protocols. New training for all staff, not just security. Community outreach programs, regular audits of security interactions. And yes, Officer Barnes will be the first to go through this program if he's willing." Mrs. Thompson spoke up for the first time. "And if he's not willing?" The executive smiled slightly. "Then that will be his choice. But I believe in giving people the chance to learn and grow. Sometimes the most powerful change comes from the most unexpected places." He pulled out another document, the renovation contract. "So here's my offer. We'll move forward with the renovation as planned, but with some additions. My company will fund the entire training program. In return, you'll commit to making real, measurable changes in how this mall operates, and in 6 months, we'll reassess." The mall manager looked like he might cry with relief. "Of course, yes, absolutely." "Good." The executive sat back down. "Now, let's talk about Officer Barnes. Where is he?" "In the security office," Mrs. Thompson replied. "He just turned in his badge." "Have him come up here." The executive's expression softened slightly. "It's time we had a real conversation." As Mrs. Thompson left to get Barnes, the executive looked around the table. "Change isn't easy," he said quietly. "But it's necessary, and sometimes the hardest moments in our lives can become the most important turning points if we're brave enough to learn from them." The room fell silent, waiting for Officer Barnes to arrive, each person lost in their own thoughts about the changes to come. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise, casting new light on the mall below. Officer Barnes stood outside the conference room door, his hands feeling strangely empty without his badge and radio. Through the frosted glass, he could see the shapes of people waiting inside. His throat felt dry, and his usual confidence had evaporated like morning dew. Mrs. Thompson opened the door. "Come in, Richard," she said quietly. The room fell silent as he entered. The executive sat at the head of the table, looking just as composed as he had in the store yesterday, but now radiating an authority that made Barnes's security guard power plays seem childish in comparison. He gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit down," the executive said. His voice was neither angry nor mocking, just calm and direct. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Barnes lowered himself into the chair, feeling every eye in the room on him. The executive picked up a remote and played a short clip from yesterday's incident. Barnes watched himself on screen, seeing his actions through new eyes. The aggressive stance, the dismissive tone, the barely concealed prejudice, it was all there in high definition. "Tell me," the executive said, pausing the video, "what do you see?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "I see myself doing my job," he started, then stopped. For the first time, he really looked at his own behavior. "No, that's not true. I see myself being the kind of person I always said I wasn't." The executive nodded slowly. "That's a good start. Honesty with ourselves is always the hardest part." He leaned forward. "You've worked here for 15 years, correct?" "Yes, sir." "In those 15 years, how many shoplifters have you caught?" Barnes thought about it. "Maybe 30, 35. "And how many people have you confronted or removed from the mall?" The number hung unspoken between them, 47 in just the last 3 months. "I want to tell you something," the executive continued. "Yesterday, when you confronted me in that store, I had 3 options. I could have shown you my ID, my credit cards, my bank balance, proved that I belonged there. I could have called my lawyers and had you fired on the spot. Or I could have done what I did, walk away and come back with a different purpose." He stood up and walked to the window. "You know what I saw when you were following me? Not just prejudice. I saw someone who truly believes they're doing the right thing. Someone who's never had to question their assumptions about who belongs where, who looks suspicious, who deserves the benefit of the doubt." Turning back to Barnes, he continued, "That's why I don't want you fired." Barnes looked up in surprise. The mall manager and Mrs. Thompson exchanged glances. "Instead, I'm offering you a choice." The executive pulled out a folder. "In here is a comprehensive training program. 6 months of learning, working with diversity experts, meeting with community members, understanding the impact of bias in security work. It won't be easy. You'll have to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself. You'll have to unlearn habits that you've built over years. But at the end of it, you'll have the chance to become something more than just a security guard. You could become a leader in changing how security work is done." He slid the folder across the table. "Or you can walk away. Take your severance pay, find another security job, continue as you have been. The choice is yours." Barnes stared at the folder. His first instinct was to refuse, to defend himself, to insist he didn't need any training. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the executive's calm demeanor, or maybe it was finally seeing himself through others' eyes. "Why?" Barnes asked finally. "Why give me this chance? After what I did?" The executive smiled slightly. "Because change has to start somewhere. And sometimes the people who seem least likely to change are the ones who can make the biggest difference once they do." He paused. "Also, I've read your performance reviews from your early years here. You used to be known for helping lost kids find their parents, for going out of your way to assist elderly shoppers, for treating everyone with respect. Somewhere along the way you lost that. I think it's worth trying to find it again." Barnes reached for the folder with slightly shaky hands. Opening it, he saw the program outline: workshops, community meetings, one-on-one sessions with diversity trainers, practical exercises. It looked challenging, maybe even overwhelming. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Then, more firmly, "I want to do it." The executive nodded. "Good. Remember this feeling, this moment of choosing to change. It won't always be easy, but this moment right here, this is how real change begins." Outside the conference room windows, the mall was coming to life. Early morning shoppers strolled past storefronts, security cameras silently watched, and somewhere in the building, Jenny was probably still making coffee. But inside this room, something fundamental has shifted, a small change that would soon ripple out to touch countless lives. The first day of training arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Barnes sat in a small conference room at the community center near the mall, nervously tapping his pen against a blank notepad. Around him sat other security officers from various shopping centers in the area, all there to learn, though none quite in the same situation as him. The trainer who walked in wasn't what Barnes expected. She was a retired police chief with gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes, carrying a stack of real-world case studies instead of the textbooks he dreaded. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Today, we're going to start by listening." She turned on a projector, but instead of PowerPoint slides, faces appeared on the screen. Regular people, sitting in their homes, telling their stories. A grandfather described being followed while shopping for his grandchildren's Christmas presents. A young professional talked about having to dress up just to browse electronics. A teenager shared how she stopped going to the mall with friends because security always singled her out. Barnes found himself sinking lower in his chair, recognizing his own actions in their stories. But the trainer wasn't there to shame anyone. "Recognition is the first step," she said gently. "You can't change what you don't acknowledge." During their lunch break, Barnes sat alone, processing what he'd heard. A young security guard from another mall joined him. "Rough morning, huh?" the guard said. "I never realized how much impact our split-second decisions could have." Barnes nodded slowly. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years of making those decisions without ever thinking about the other side. Back in the afternoon session, they did role-playing exercises. Barnes had to play the part of a shopper being profiled, while another guard acted as security. The familiar scenario played out, but this time, Barnes felt the anxiety, the frustration, the helplessness from the other side. His hands started sweating, his heart rate increased, just from pretending. "This is nothing," the trainer explained. "Imagine feeling this way every time you go shopping, every time you see a security guard, every time you try to live your normal life." That evening, Barnes sat in his car in the community center parking lot, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, older, maybe wiser, definitely more uncertain than the man who'd walked into Designer's Haven that day. He pulled out his phone and opened the mall's social media pages. Comments about the incident were still flowing in, but something caught his eye. The executive had posted a statement about implementing new security training programs. The comment section was filled with people sharing their own stories, not just negative experiences, but hopes for change. One comment stood out: "Real change starts with people willing to learn from their mistakes." Hoping this is the beginning of something better. The next morning, Barnes arrived early for training. He'd spent half the night writing in a journal the trainer had given them, really thinking about his actions, his assumptions, the way he'd let bias cloud his judgment year after year. The trainer noticed his red eyes but didn't comment. Instead, she handed him a new exercise, community outreach planning. "Today," she said, "we start building bridges." Barnes looked at the blank paper in front of him. Building bridges seemed like such a simple phrase for such a monumental task. How do you rebuild trust that's been broken for years? How do you prove that change is real, not just a PR move? As if reading his mind, the trainer sat down beside him. "You know what the hardest part of change is?" she asked quietly. "It's not learning new information. It's unlearning what you thought you knew for sure." She pulled out a newspaper clipping, a story about a security guard who'd become a community liaison, transforming his mall into a place where everyone felt welcome. "This could be you," she said. "But first, you have to be willing to feel uncomfortable, to question everything you think you know about safety, about suspicion, about who belongs where." Barnes picked up his pen and began to write. His first words surprised him: "I'm sorry, and I'm ready to learn." Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Inside, in that small conference room, another kind of light was beginning to break through, the light of understanding, of change, of possibility. The trainer walked around the room, watching her students work. She'd seen this transformation before, the slow, sometimes painful process of people confronting their biases and choosing to change. It wasn't always successful, but when it worked, it changed not just one person, but entire communities. Barnes looked up from his writing to see the executive from the mall standing in the doorway, observing quietly. Their eyes met, and this time Barnes didn't look away. Instead, he nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of commitment to the journey ahead. 3 months into the training program, Riverside Mall was starting to feel different. The renovation work had begun, with construction crews working overnight to minimize disruption. But the real changes weren't in the building's structure, they were in the way people moved through the space. Barnes stood at his old post, now wearing a new uniform. The security guard outfit had been replaced with a blue blazer that read Community Relations on the badge. It wasn't just a change of clothes, it represented everything he'd learned over the past months. A young mother struggled with a stroller near the entrance. Before, Barnes might have watched her suspiciously. Now, he walked over with a smile. "Need a hand?" he asked, holding the door open. The grateful look on her face reminded him why he'd chosen to embrace this change. The morning routine had transformed too. Jenny at the coffee kiosk now had real conversations with him instead of awkward silences. "You're different," she said one day, sliding his coffee across the counter. "In a good way." "I'm trying," he replied honestly, and he was. The training hadn't been easy. There were days when he wanted to quit, when confronting his own biases felt too painful. But then he'd remember the faces from those videos, the grandfather buying Christmas presents, the teenager avoiding the mall, the executive in the hoodie who gave him a second chance. Today was a big test. The mall was hosting its first Community Connection Day, an event Barnes had helped plan. Local groups had set up booths throughout the mall, sharing their cultures, stories, and traditions. The smell of food from around the world filled the air, and music from different cultures played softly through the speakers. Barnes walked through the crowds, not to intimidate but to connect. He stopped at a booth where an elderly woman was teaching children how to write their names in Arabic calligraphy. 3 months ago, he might have hurried past. Today, he paused to watch, amazed by the beauty of the flowing script. "Would you like to try?" she asked, holding out a pen. Barnes hesitated, then sat down. His attempt was clumsy, but the woman was patient. "Every letter tells a story," she explained, guiding his hand. "Just like every person has one." Near the food court, a group of teenagers hung out, laughing and taking selfies. In the past, he would have watched them like a hawk, waiting for trouble. Now he noticed one of them. A girl he'd once asked to leave the mall. She saw him too, and tensed up. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "What I did that day was wrong. I'm sorry." The surprise on her face slowly turned to a small smile. "I heard you were different now," she said. "My mom didn't believe it, but I told her people can change." Throughout the day, more moments like this unfolded, small bridges being built, one conversation at a time. The executive stopped by in the afternoon, walking through the event with the mall manager. When they passed Barnes's station, the executive paused. "How's it going?" he asked, genuinely interested. Barnes thought for a moment. "It's hard," he admitted. "Unlearning habits, facing up to mistakes. But it's worth it. I'm starting to see things I was blind to before." The executive nodded. "That's exactly what growth feels like." As the day wound down, Barnes helped the community groups pack up their booths. A little boy ran up to him, holding out a piece of paper. It was his name written in Arabic, English, and Chinese characters collected from different booths around the mall. "Look what I learned," the boy said excitedly. His mother stood nearby smiling. Barnes knelt down to admire the artwork. "That's amazing," he said. "You know what's cool? Every one of these ways of writing tells us something different about the world." The boy beamed and ran back to his mother. Watching them leave, Barnes noticed his reflection in a store window. The face looking back at him was the same, but the eyes were different, softer, more understanding, more aware of the world around him. Later that night, as he made his final rounds, Barnes stopped at the spot where he'd confronted the executive months ago. The store was being renovated now, its windows covered in paper. But through a gap, he could see the new sign being installed. "Everyone welcome here." He touched his new badge, thinking about how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. Change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And for the first time in his career, he was actually proud of the direction he was heading. 6 months had passed since that day in Designers Haven. The mall's renovation was complete, its grand reopening just hours away. Early morning light streamed through the new glass ceiling, illuminating the transformed space below. But the physical changes, the modern decor, the comfortable seating areas, the children's play spaces, were just the surface of what had really changed at Riverside Mall. Barnes stood in front of the mirror in the staff room, adjusting his new uniform. He was no longer just a security guard. Today was his first official day as head of community relations and security training. The position hadn't existed 6 months ago. Neither had the person he'd become. Nervous? The executive's voice came from the doorway. He'd come for the reopening ceremony, but there was another reason for his visit. A little, Barnes admitted. It's a big responsibility. That's exactly why you're the right person for it. The executive handed him a folder. The other malls in our network want to implement your training program. They've heard about what we've done here. Barnes opened the folder to find statistics from the past 6 months. Customer satisfaction up 40%, incident reports down 60%, and most importantly, 0 complaints of racial profiling. But it was the personal stories attached that meant the most, letters from community members describing how the mall had changed. Remember that teenage girl you apologized to at the community day? The executive asked. She's joining our youth advisory board. Says she wants to help make sure other kids never feel unwelcome like she did. The mall was starting to come alive around them. Jenny from the coffee kiosk waved as she set up for the day. She'd helped Barnes practice his speech for the reopening ceremony last night, staying late to listen to him rehearse. A group of new security officers gathered near the main entrance for their morning briefing. Barnes had helped design their training program, making sure it focused on community connection first, enforcement second. Their uniforms were different now, more approachable, less intimidating. But the biggest change was in their attitudes. You know, Barnes said, watching them interact with early morning walkers, I used to think my job was about keeping people out. Now I understand it's about welcoming people in. The executive smiled. That's what real security looks like, when people feel safe, not scared. The opening ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. By 9:30, crowds had gathered outside. Barnes walked through the mall one last time before the doors opened, remembering how far they'd come. Near Designer's Haven, now beautifully renovated, he paused. A new sign hung above the entrance. All are welcome here in multiple languages. Below it, a smaller plaque read, Where Change Begins, dedicated to our community and the power of second chances. The executive joined him, looking at the plaque. You helped write that, didn't you? Barnes nodded, seemed fitting. This spot changed my life. As they walked toward the main entrance, Barnes saw familiar faces in the crowd, the elderly calligraphy artist who'd taught him Arabic letters, the mother and son from Community Day, even his old trainer from the program. They'd all become part of the mall's extended family. Ready? The executive asked as the clock approached 10. Barnes took a deep breath. In his pocket was his speech, but he knew he wouldn't need it. The words would come from his heart. The doors opened and people streamed in, their voices filling the space with energy and life. Children ran to the new play area, elderly couples headed for the comfortable seating nooks, teenagers gathered around the new community bulletin board that showcased local artists. Barnes stepped up to the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. 6 months ago, he would have seen potential threats. Today, he saw neighbors, friends, community. Welcome, he began, his voice strong and clear. Welcome to everyone. 6 months ago, I learned the hardest and most important lesson of my life right here in this mall. I learned that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. I learned that change isn't just possible, it's essential. He saw the executive nodding encouragingly from the side. This mall isn't just a place to shop, Barnes continued. It's a place where all of us, every single one of us, belongs. A place where mistakes can turn into miracles, where prejudice can turn into understanding, and where a security guard who thought he knew everything can learn the most valuable lesson of all, that true security comes from building bridges, not walls. The crowd applauded, and Barnes felt something he'd never experienced in his 15 years at the mall, pure, genuine pride. Not in his authority or power, but in his ability to change, to grow, to help create something better. As the ceremony ended and people dispersed to explore the new mall, the executive shook Barnes's hand. You know, he said quietly, sometimes the best way to measure success isn't in numbers or statistics. It's in moments like this, when a place becomes more than a building, when it becomes a home for everyone. Barnes watched as a group of teenagers, including some he would have once viewed with suspicion, helped an elderly woman find her way to the new information desk. "You're right," he said, "and we're just getting started."